Hi, this is PJ Garcia of Beach Pacific Escrow in Huntington Beach, California.
And I'm Genia Engelstad from Elite Escrow Services in San Diego, California.
And this is our first episode of Escrow Talk.
We kind of crack ourselves up when we say that because we think it's kind of cute, but we hope everybody will like it, right, PJ?
We hope so. Okay. Joining us today are some of our other escrow friends, Linda Hamilton from Chicago Title in Oxnard, California, Tracy White from International City Escrow in Long Beach, and Carmen Martinez from Cardinal Pacific Escrow in Long Beach, and they'll be joining in with us as we go along. But first, we want to talk a little bit today about the new TRID. Oh, before we do that, though, we need to do a little legal work.
Yeah, we just want to remind everybody that our whole talk and our whole show is for informational purposes only. And you don't want to think of it as legal advice because escrow people aren't attorneys. That's not really our function in the transaction. So make sure that you always contact your legal counsel and your management before you act on anything. But we just want to throw out some ideas here, and, that's what we're here for.
Perfect. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the TRID, which if you have been in a cave on a desert island and haven't heard of it, it's the new mortgage closing disclosures and associated rules that take effect August 1st of 2015.
Well, we're all about acronyms in our business, right? So we want to tell everybody what TRID stands for. It's the TILA, T-I-L-A, RESPA Integrated Disclosure. That's the Truth in Lending Act and the Real Estate Settlements Procedures Act. So, and they call it the TRID, which spelled backwards is
dirt.
And it's kind of a dirty business. We think it is, but we think that it's going to be okay. It's just a little bump in our escrow road. We think it's going to be okay, but we want to educate people and let everybody know what's going on.
The more people are prepared for it, the easier it will be. We want to talk to our real estate friends a little bit today who may not have had as long an exposure to this concept as Gina and I and some of the other escrow professionals in this room have. We've been following it literally since the inception of the CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the Bureau as they like to be known.
But if you are here today listening to this, hopefully if you want to know anything about escrow, you'll kind of have a little bit of background about the CFPB, and maybe in other presentations we'll talk and we'll get more basic about it. But in this particular one, we're assuming that you're a realtor and you kind of have an idea of what the CFPB is, and you're at a place where you're hearing people talk about TRID and you want to kind of understand what it really means. Is that kind of where we are in this presentation today?
I think so. We're doing the big picture today. We'll get into some little bit of detail. But
Tracy, while we're here talking about this, what do you think is the biggest thing that people need to know? I mean, what's the biggest challenge you have as an escrow person?
I think communicating with the realtors and getting them on the same page. I don't think they're fully aware of the impact this is going to have. I believe it'll blow all timelines out of the water on the purchase contract. The 30-day escrow is probably going to be more like 45. And the way they do business normally is going to completely change. And what I mean by that is it's all about timelines now. So things they used to do before wasn't a big deal. Now it is. It could delay their transaction a week, 10 days.
But PJ, do you remember just this week, I think the CFPB came out with something that they say that we are mistaken, that this timeline is really not going to make any difference. I think it just came out like Friday because this is the first part of June.
So. It did. Yes. They're trying to calm nerves and explain that there are really only 3 instances where a closing would be delayed. And those 3, let me see off the top of my head, are if there's a prepayment penalty is added, there's a change in the loan terms, or a change in the fees that causes the APR tolerance to be greater than I think it's an eighth of a percent.
A point on one type of loan and a quarter on the other.
Right.
But I think that that's towards the end of the transaction. And I think if you familiarize yourself with the TRID and the CFPB, and if you go to their website, it's www.cfpb.gov. Know before you owe. If you go there, you'll also find out that there are other days that are built in, like when the buyer gets the loan application. The buyer executes a loan application with the lender. The lender has 3 days to give them their new loan estimate,
which isn't new because they already have that rule in place. What's changed is they took away one of the wild card pieces of data that would trigger that application being formal.
But now don't the buyers, or is it new, but don't the borrowers have 10 days to accept the loan, to say that they're intending to proceed with the loan?
Right. That is the other change, is that the buyers or borrowers have 10 days to make that decision, and the lender can't charge them, incur any costs within that 10 days. So you're not going to see appraisals being ordered until that is received. Now, the borrower can submit that acceptance and sooner.
So Tracy, from your experience, if in the contract today, when we're talking the real estate purchase contract from CAR that most of our agents in California use, if the buyer gets the estimate after 3 days, that's 3 days from acceptance, right? And then let's say they take 5 days to tell the lender they're intending to proceed, what's that going to do with the 17-day appraisal contingency?
Well, you're 8 days into the transaction and appraisal hasn't even been ordered yet, right? So what is the backlog with the appraiser?
Right.
You know, there's other issues too. If you're talking about physical inspections, for example, or this new termite issue that we have, where a lot of the agents are dealing with the termite repairs on the repair request form. So you could be 10 days into escrow before you get that. A lot of times what we're seeing is a credit. Well, guess what happens with a credit?
Well, if we're talking about the first part of the transaction, then this is where you're getting PJ right into the idea that possibly the escrow could be extended, because if you're not ordering the appraisal right away, how are you going to make that contingency period? Then you have a loan contingency of 21 days?
Yes.
Of course, it can be changed. Sure. So then that's what we're talking about, how the close of escrow could be affected.
So the idea here is that the transaction or the contingency timeframes that are sort of hard-coded into the residential purchase agreement are not going to work with the new mortgage rules. So agents need to be aware of that. I think the most important takeaway for an agent right now, and frankly for escrow people too, is to manage expectations.
Agreed.
We need to educate our consumers, sellers and buyers, that this is not your father's escrow. This is not your father's real estate purchase. It's going to be different than what you've experienced before. The jury's out on better or worse, but it will be different. And if we do that education process up front and manage their expectations, we will have happier consumers. And why is a happier consumer important, Gina?
Because then, well, I could really say many reasons why I think a happy consumer is better.
But in the context of the CFPB,
well, the CFPB is all about the consumer. That's their name, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Although let's make a note that they only consider the borrower to be the consumer.
Yes, they do. In this particular scenario, the seller is really not a consumer until he buys and gets a loan, right? So I think it's really important to make sure that the consumer is satisfied, because the CFPB has that whole complaint database. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly.
So it's really important, because the CFPB has a place that consumers can go in there and say, I didn't really like my experience with XYZ Realtor, and the lender of the ABC Realtor really didn't do a good job. Then you kind of have a little ding, and you don't know how the CFPB is going to respond to that. And sometimes the consumer is confused about something that really isn't part of something that the realtor did did or the lender did. So it's really important for us to make sure that the consumers understand that there may be some delays. And look, if you have a 45-day escrow and you close it in 40 days, that's great. But if you say you have a hard 30-day escrow and you close it in 45, then you're going to have consumers, sellers, everyone who's going to have a problem.
I think that's another issue too, is making sure, some people have their niche, like there's buyer's agents and there's listing agents. So from a listing agent's perspective, they really need to get on board with this. Sometimes we see late closing per diems. We don't believe those to be APR affecting. But to put that on somebody on a 30-day escrow when up front it's probably 45, that's going to be an issue.
Do you want to talk a little bit? Do we talk about the time frames a little bit? Do you feel comfortable in talking about the 3-day rule, Linda? We have you here for another thing, but what do you think about the 3-day, when the buyer has to receive the disclosure?
Well, I think the concern some of us have about that is the delivery of the notice. The closing disclosure has to be delivered. It can be delivered one of 3 ways. You can hand it to them. In that case, day 1 is the day you hand it to them. You can mail it, and there are mail guidelines that have to be followed, or you can overnight it. We're hearing now that most lenders aren't even going to care. They're going to count 3 days.
PJ, will you talk about the closing disclosure? Because we kind of jumped right into that.
Well, let's back up even a little bit more than that. Part of this whole new mortgage world that we live in is the mandate on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from Congress when they passed the Dodd-Frank Act was to combine and simplify the mortgage disclosures in a residential purchase. So we had the initial truth in lending disclosure and the good faith estimate on the front end. And on the back end, they would receive the final good faith estimate and the HUD-1. So now they've combined the initial documents, the initial good faith estimate and initial truth in lending statement into the loan estimate. And that loan estimate has to be provided within 3 days of receipt of the what triggers the receipt of the application. Then it can be amended, it can be updated and revised as the transaction continues. But the CFPB really expects the information on that loan estimate on day 1 to be accurate.
To the best figures that you have at the time.
It's based on the best knowledge, but you have to do a good faith effort. You can't just pull figures out of the air and expect that to be seen as a good faith.
I kind of jumped forward with Linda on that, but so that loan estimate. So once the borrower gets that loan estimate, okay, because we kind of jumped a little bit because we were just talking. If they get the loan estimate, so towards the end of the transaction, the lender issues the closing disclosure. So those 2 documents need to match in fees so that the buyer as much as possible.
Yes.
Well, we're hearing that there can be several closing disclosures issued. Yeah. So that's giving some of us pause too. And a lot of us are questioning at closing, we have to have a final word from the lender to even disperse. And what we're hearing is they can actually change that closing disclosure a little bit after closing. So when do we disperse? And we're kind of getting ahead. Right. But to back up, can I add something? I think it's important to note here that some people may be saying, okay, to make this all done, let's get these buyers in or borrowers and get them going, or buyers particular with what I'm going to say. But the problem is they can't do pre-loan applications because there has to be a property named in order for them to get a loan estimate. So it's one of the triggering items. So for people who are thinking, hey, we'll just get our buyer in there and we'll get this done, it doesn't happen because in order to issue a loan estimate, they have to have an identified property.
So we talked about the loan estimate at the beginning a little bit because we kind of jumped a little bit.
Yeah, so now I was going to go to the closing disclosure.
So we talked about the delays in the transaction because of the time frame. So now we're going to fast forward. We're going to pretend that our world is all blue skies and butterflies, right? And everything.
Because our world is blue skies and butterflies.
And rainbows too. So we're going to get down towards the end of the transaction. We're 10 days prior to close, our regular scheduled close date. So what is supposed to happen, Tracy?
Well, we just found out that the buyer's married, and we didn't know. Now we have quitclaim deeds. I'm backing up again because I think the agents need to understand that information for us is power. I think the lender the agents and escrow have absolutely got to be hitting the ground, communicating at 100% full speed. We need to know, is your buyer in town for the closing? Where are they going to be around? Are we going to have messenger fees? Do we have quick claim deeds? Do we have judgments or credit card debt that has to be paid off? All of these things have to be answered up front. That affects the fees.
Yes, and that affects the disclosure.
And it affects the disclosure. So, the last minute credits for the dishwasher on the walkthrough, the $700 repair credit, the quick claim deed, all those things affect. So a fully completed contract, and I know agents out there have heard escrow say that before, but it is never more important than it is right now.
Well, the lenders are going to start to reject them and ask.
They are starting to reject them, and we need addresses, phone numbers, contact information. We need access to these.
And I think that I don't know about you guys, but in San Diego, everyone, as soon as they enter into a contract, goes on vacation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're leaving at 5. They need their instructions, right?
And they're going on vacation. And I always find that fascinating because, everyone says real estate is expensive and whatever, but people evidently can afford it and they go on vacation. But this is what happens in San Diego. So we need, right now more than ever, we really need to know where our clients are going to be during the whole course of the time.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I have something to add about that. Just to say, I just have one right now. The buyers are leaving for Germany today. The seller is in Italy. And the listing agent is in Africa. So it's real. That happens. But I think there's something we're missing here. And I had a lender bring this up to me the other day, and that is mechanic lien issues.
Oh, yeah.
Because what happens, when we have a rehab loan, some buyers, when they're getting certain types of FHA loans and certain types of loans, it's for rehab, right? What if you have a restart and you have a priority problem? What happens with a priority problem? You have indemnity issues. You have maybe endorsements that need to be issued by the title company that are quite expensive. All of those things affect the APR. Solar leases.
That's a big thing right
So things that have to do with anything that's going, and those affect the APR, by the way.
Sure do.
Communication's key, I think, is what we're trying to say.
We have about 4 topics in this one conversation, but you see, when escrow people get together, this is what we do. But I want to dial it back just 1 second, back to where we were before. So at the beginning of the transaction, it's day 1, it's acceptance. The buyer gets the loan estimate, which replaces the current good faith estimate, right? So the buyer gets the loan estimate. They say, yes, I'm going to go with ABC lender. Okay. Everything's plugging along. They're ordering the appraisal. All these things are happening. So you're getting down close to closing. Okay, 10 days. You're 10 days out, and the lender is trying to pull together the final figures. I'm putting that, if you could see me on the radio, I'm air quoting. So you've got the final figures. So what happens when you get that final figure?
Well, the lender is going to be working with the escrow company as the conduit for all of the fees and charges in the transaction. So we're going to be needing to get that information in as accurate a form as possible, because the only, of course, fee that we really have control over that we're feeding to the lender is our own. And our own is based on the information we know, which can change over time.
Which brings into what Tracy said, people leaving, what's happening. So these are things that need to communicate with us.
Because some of those things actually do still affect the APR, even though, unless there's an affiliation between the lender and the settlement agent or escrow agent, that's the only time the whole escrow fee goes into the APR.
And when you say APR, annual percentage rate.
That is the annual percentage rate, and that is what the CFPB watches. That's the number. So it's like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's just gone out of my head.
You'll have to tune into our next podcast to find out the answer for that, because we're all going, what? Okay. But no, we know intimately what it means.
But the APR is the magic number, and it currently is on the Truth in Lending, what's the name? The Reg Z. Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm having senior moments. So at that point, what you have to understand is these regulations, like all others in the mortgage related industry, are all emanate out of Washington, D.C. All the people that work for these regulatory agencies, they know the Beltway. They know maybe how closings are done in D.C., Virginia, Maryland, New York. And clearly, if you've ever had any touching of any transaction outside of the West Coast, you know that they do it entirely differently. And most of the East Coast does roundtable closings. Oftentimes, each side has an attorney representing them. So we're in a different world here, and they intellectually understand that, but gosh, it's hard for them to really wrap their heads around the way we do things here.
We don't have roundtable closings where the buyers and sellers are sitting at a table and we're passing keys and checks at the same time.
And the moving van's waiting outside because the buyer's moving in that day.
We don't have those types of transactions, but I have to say, just because we don't close escrows or transactions that way, it doesn't mean that we don't close the majority of the transactions in the country this way. I mean, we do a good job and we do it well, but they've tried to make this procedure something that you do nationwide, and it's kind of complicated. But when we do the closing disclosure, which replaces, it kind of puts two forms together.
Right. The closing disclosure is now what the blended final good faith estimate and HUD-1 are. Mm-hmm. So there is no more HUD-1 settlement statement. And that is going to blow, because realtors during the short sale market, after the last round of HUD revisions and the concurrent short sale boom, I never before that knew a realtor that really knew what a HUD-1 was. Very few, let alone knew the line numbers. And all of a sudden I had realtors quoting line numbers to me.
So they're going to be sorely a little surprised that there's not going to be a HUD-1, but only for specific transaction. But a regular 1 to 4 family transaction, there's going to be the closing disclosure. And on the HUD is only going to be used for HELOCs, home equity lines of credit, mobile home, reverse mortgages. So we're not going to see that form as to be used for estimates or anything. They're going to be seeing probably what we use normally in California, a debit credit closing statement and the closing disclosure. And we want to remember that the closing disclosure is a 5-page document because it's including our HUD-1, plus it's having some disclosures, the truth in lending disclosures that the lender is required to do.
It's 5 pages. It's 5 letter pages. Versus 3 legal pages. So it isn't so much different, but it does have more information. What the CFPB's intent is to give the buyer one document that tells them everything they could ever possibly want to know about the transaction. So it will contain the name and contact information for every person, realtor, escrow, title, lender that touches that transaction.
And it also has all the fees. The couple of the pages look very similar to the current HUD-1, where it talks about, how the fees are and stuff like that. But a main difference between this form and the HUD is that even though there are some numberings, like in sections, there's a highlight, what do you call it? Titles of sections. But within those sections, everything is alphabetized.
There are no more line
there's no line 1800 and 200 and whatever. So, it's a massive job to name everything we call something in a closing the same across the country because even
they want it to be the same.
They want it to be the same. And even from me in San Diego to Oxnard, she may call something different.
And then loan estimate has to match the closing disclosure estimate. So if the lender writes termite inspection and then we put termite report on the closing disclosure statement, red flag, red flag. And so there's going to be a bell curve. There's going to be a learning curve. And, what realtors often don't see is the 3 or 4 HUDs we have to produce to the lender before docs even arrive. We're going to have a similar situation with the closing disclosure statement. That is not going to change.
No. And 3 is good.
I was being kind. So when you have a good lender, you can get it done in about 2 or 3.
Because they want to look. Because it's like one of those things. Do you like it, or is it it's a back and forth thing?
And this is a huge change for all of us. So it's gonna take a little more time to get into the swing.
Right, but we will be communicating with them and working side by side with the lender on getting the figures for that closing disclosure correct. So what happens now is the rule says that that the borrower has to have that closing disclosure 3 days before consummation.
And let's all talk, since we're all adults and we're all adults that are listening to this, let's talk about what consummation is. No. I think it is kind of funny, but they use this word consummation in every meeting I've gone to about it. Everyone's laughing about it. But we have to think about what a lender, because remember, a CFPB is all about the consumer. They're about the consumer who is the buyer, and they're about the lender who's the creditor. So what is the lender concerned about when we're talking about consummation? And I see our friend Carmen over there has decided to take the mic. Go, Carmen.
Well, Gina, as far as my understanding is concerned, the lender considers consummation the date that the document is signed by the borrower. That is the date they consider the borrower enters into a legally binding agreement with that particular lender.
Well, let's do a sidebar here and say why the lenders are going to be so cautious on this. Under the previous rules, the HUD and the regulator now, CFPB, did not have much capacity to do fines. The fines today, going after August 1st, start at, help me ladies, is it $5,000 a day?
Then if it's a more willful violation, if they keep doing it, becomes $25,000. And then if they're like really not ignoring the law, it could be as much as $1 million a day.
And this is per loan per day that it's out of compliance. So that adds up pretty darn quickly. So the lenders are the CFPB has their attention. So they will do everything possible to make sure they're not out of tolerance with.
So it's very important for the realtors that are listening to this, when an escrow person, a lender, or someone gives them that calendar and says, if you want to close this day, this is when the buyer has to receive the notice, right? The CD, and this is when they can consummate the loan. So tell us
a 10-day.
So tell us again. Let's just talk about the 5-day first, because we didn't even finish it. So they received the disclosure, they signed for it, the closing disclosure on Monday. So that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The first day they can sign the loan documents is Thursday. So that means the buyer signs his loan docs, right? And we make an appointment. Now, this is another thing that realtors need to pay attention to too, is that when are we going to get the loan docs? Are they going to be released on Monday when the closing disclosure is released? No. Well, Carmen thinks no. I live in the blue sky butterfly world, Carmen. And what I hope is that when they release that CD, maybe what they'll do is predate the docs. Now, we have had lenders from back east that'll predate them. Right. And so that we can't sign them because they're dated 3 days away, right? At least. And that at least what I think, because I don't think it's just the HUD and the Reg Z that the buyers have questions about. It's that stack of docs.
And the CFPB has said they don't want consumers to be faced with a couple inches of documents that they've never seen before at the closing table.
And that's what will happen if lenders don't release that. Now, Carmen, you had a thought.
I get a lot of conflicting information as far as that goes, and it depends on which lender you're speaking with.
Yeah, right.
Some lenders have said absolutely not. They will not release not one part of the loan docs. They're concerned as far as the signing and what triggers the consumption date. The consummation date as far as the loan docs is concerned.
So that's a big deal for the lender if it gets signed early. Some
are also saying that because the critical part of the documents is the note. That's what they're actually looking at. Some are saying that they may release some of the additional parts of the documents and just hold the note and not even a draft, not a copy of the note, because the moment that they sign it triggers the consummation.
Yeah, there was
they are concerned.
And in my blue sky world, they would send, whether it's watermark draft or doesn't have the note or whatever. But in a blue sky world, they would send that out to the consumer and the escrow along with the closing disclosure, so that we then would have a chance to do our job and prepare.
Wait. Now you are blue sky.
I'm very blue sky.
Let's go back to the real world.
To have a chance to do our job in a real rational time setting where we weren't rushed and being interrupted every 5 seconds and making mistakes.
Okay, I'm going to bring you girls back one more time. So the buyer gets the disclosure on Monday. They sign on Thursday. What happened? Okay, so they can sign. They can consummate, Tracy, on Thursday. Let's all smile when we say that word. They can consummate on Thursday. So what happens on Thursday if we don't have the docs, Tracy? Tell me what you think is going to happen.
Oh, if we're prepared to consummate and we can't consummate, well, we're not going to be happy. Be very frustrated.
That is a little escrow humor that you'd have to just excuse us for a minute. But yeah, very little humor.
This is how we keep doing our job, is our humor.
So we get the docs. We open at 8:30 in the morning. The buyer comes in at 8:35. That really is not realistic.
Well, that's what's going to happen, probably.
But aren't we going to have time? They're still going to be emailing us.
So like PJ said, because we've been asking this question for about a year and a half now. Are we going to have a chance to actually review these documents? When we very first started hearing it, we got the impression that we perhaps were. Now, as Carmen has alluded to, no, because they're concerned that the docs are going to get signed too early. And as you said, it doesn't matter. We don't know. The bottom line is we don't know what's going to happen. We're going to have to wait and see.
Okay, but girls, it's like herding cats in this room today. I know. We all have a microphone. Okay, I think Linda Hamilton has something to say. Linda.
I think none of us would run the risk. And I think if a lender thinks this through, none of us would run the risk of having those documents signed early and costing the lender $25,000 a day or $5,000 a day. None of us, because the upshot of that is we won't have their business anymore, and we all know they have that power. Right. They will now have that power to say that vendor is no good. We're not using.
Well, that's a topic for another day. However, but it is a big deal.
Yes. But wouldn't you all agree in this room, and I would hope that you would, that it would be better for the consumer, to benefit the consumer, to be able to have the opportunity to have a certain amount of time to have a copy of those docs that they can look at before they sign them?
Well, if I may, because now you're going to get me on my soapbox, but absolutely. I mean, a long, long time ago, back in the days of old, buyers would go into the bank and sign their loan documents. And who would explain those documents? The people that drew them, the people that know what's in them. Now, over time, Escrow has taken that job over, but it's going to be interesting to see, right? I mean, these banks are subject to huge fines. We sign documents with people. We do a very good job at it. But at the end of the day,
So what normally happens today is at 4:55 on a Friday night,
We'll get
the lender the lender will hit send on the loan docs. So we get them, and the buyer wants to come in at 5 and sign. But we have to download the docs. We have to get the program. We have to print them. Many of us have outside notaries, whatever. So even though they have that 3 days, we're still going to have that thing where the buyers are going to have time to sign the docs. And how long does it take to sign docs? An hour?
if you do explaining and people haven't bought a house before, it's going to take a good hour.
But wouldn't it be better? I'm just saying, in those realtors that are out there, and that you have some pull with your legislator or whatever to say, wouldn't it be better for the buyer to have time to look at those docs? And if the lenders would release them, at least when they came in, they'd already have their questions because they've already had a chance to look at them.
They would have had a chance to ask their questions of the right person, which is the lender.
And don't forget, it gives us a chance to make sure they're right, because guess what? Sometimes docs are wrong. A name's spelled wrong, a street is spelled wrong. The figure that we got on the preliminary HUD or the CD, as the case may be now, is not what comes out on the docs. We've all had these scenarios.
So they get the CD, closing disclosure. In the CD now, people, let's all take note, a CD now is not that round thing that you put into the CD player that plays music.
It'll never be the same again.
A certificate of deposit, that's a good one. See, I wasn't even thinking of that. But so the buyer gets their closing disclosure. They have 3 days. They come in on Thursday. They make an appointment. They come in and sign their loan documents. We still have to do our same thing. We have to package the documents right. We probably have to send them back to the lender.
Let's stop and go back a second, because we haven't talked about the time it takes us once we've downloaded and printed the documents to review them and read through how many pages of lenders' closing instructions,
which are going to be very important to read right now.
I'm hoping what'll happen is when they release the CD, that closing disclosure that will get the lender's instructions, and they'll let us know that the buyer has received the CD. Because remember, the buyer is the consumer in this thing, but remember, we as escrow, the settlement agent, has the obligation to give the final CD to the who? The seller.
And that's what I wanted to talk about before we got a little distracted, is that it's important to understand that even though this rule is all about the borrower, the CFPB still requires that the seller receive a closing disclosure. There was a lot of talk and anxiety initially about who would deliver the closing disclosure to the buyer. There's a lot of liability in how that's delivered and when it's delivered. So the escrow industry, a lot of us said, look, this is no longer a settlement statement. It's a loan disclosure, and therefore we're not the appropriate people to be giving it. So we didn't want to do it. We're pleased to see that many of the major lenders have decided there's too much at risk for them to put that task on us as well. So we believe that the majority of lenders will be delivering the closing disclosure to the borrower. However, the rule states that the seller has to receive their closing disclosure before the consummation. It can be the same day, I think. Yeah, it can be the same day.
But it had to be within 24 hours, right?
No. We were just
Prior to consummation.
on or before consummation. On or before consummation. They can't receive it like the Friday in our scenario. They can't receive it. They have to receive it on
And
that.
The seller's disclosure is only 2 pages. It doesn't have, of course, all of the credit information that the buyer's does, but they have to receive it. So now let's talk briefly about what happens, because we know in California, we don't close the day the documents are signed. We don't close at consummation. We close by the contractual date, which is recording of the documents. So that's typically, okay, now we're in the world that we know that we get the loan documents, we get the documents signed, then we have to package them up and send them back to the lender. Even if they quote unquote wet fund or table fund, they won't. That's a misnomer, because table funding is really what they do in the states where they do roundtable closings and everybody's at the table and all the documents and money changes hands.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What I'm wondering about is in states back east where they do sit around the table and they are literally signing the paperwork, which and now with this new CFPB regs, that would be consummation, right? Mm-hmm. But they usually disperse.
Right.
They won't be able to because the lender has to give final say-so and final approval of that CD for them to disperse. Is the lender going to be there?
Well, I'm not really sure. Well, first of all, in the past they were, and I think we may be headed that direction again because there is so much liability. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, because the only time the lender's going to know if there's they issued the closing disclosure. Remember that.
Right.
So they're only going to know if there's a change if we tell them, which we're obligated to do, but we're only going to know the changes that happen pre-closing. There's a final walkthrough, and there's, as you said, the broken dishwasher. Now, the CFPB has said in its latest release, to clarify, seller credits to the buyer for issues at walkthrough will not require a new closing disclosure and 3-day waiting period. But other changes can trigger that redisclosure with the 3-day waiting period. And remember, 3 days can really be 10 days.
Depending on how you deliver
Or
it.
7 days.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. So I think we need to let the agents know that, and the realtors that we're talking to, is that there's going to be a lot of dates on that closing now. You have the consummation date, you have the recording date, which is what we consider close of escrow in California, right? You might have lenders want to know the disbursement date. I guess the settlement date will be the consummation date. I don't know. And so, but the good thing that I want to say is about California is that we have our trusty debit credit closing statement that I think all of us use already. We've been using it for years.
You get it every transaction, even along with the HUD one.
Some of the other states across the nation are kind of falling into that because they're realizing that, because many of them just use the HUD.
Right.
Yeah. And so they're realizing that debit credit closing statement. So I think that the agents have to know that we have these things going on. This is something that's coming up in our world. And when is the date for that, Linda?
For what? August 1st? August 1st is our date. However, we have been told recently that the fines will not come into effect until January 1st if we show good faith. Yeah, there are a lot of
The CFPB issued a very qualified statement about relaxed enforcement. However, that doesn't. An important thing to note is this new rule also comes with a private right of action, which means consumers can sue the lender, and that is not stayed in any way, shape, or form at this point. We're hoping, and there are several bills in Congress, because Congress has been listening to the industry and saying, look, before you've always given the industries an opportunity to try these forms out and see how they work and what the kinks are before you started enforcing. In this case, yes, you very generously gave them, I think, 22 months to notice before the implementation to get everything in play. And that's not insignificant. We're talking about major software rewrites and major training, which we
did this in 2010.
We'd already done in 2010, correct. So this is another new complete revamp. But they will not allow a lender to use these new forms prior to August 1st. So they said it's not really realistic nor fair to say you can't use it beforehand and you're 100% responsible for everything that happens afterwards, even though the industry is saying, look, we know there are going to be issues that we've thought of and issues that no one's thought of.
Well, and I want to interject one more thing when we're talking about the end of the transaction and the 3 days. So we already see right now that we had some days that we talked about at the beginning that might be built in when the buyer receives their loan estimate and whatever. We talked about maybe the 17-day contingency period, for the appraisal, the 21 days, all the days that we're familiar with. But I have heard people talk, well, that 3 days that the buyer has to receive, the consumer has to receive that disclosure, that's like a right of rescission. And it's really not like a right of rescission like you have on a refinance. It's not like the buyer can say, oh, by the way, I changed my mind. I'm not doing the whole thing. The other thing, and I know PJ will have some things to say about this, but I have heard some people say that you can waive that 3-day review period. There is nothing in the law, statute in the world that says that any borrower, consumer can waive that 3 days.
Actually, there is for financial hardship, but that is very limited, and I would compare it to, especially in light of the fine and penalties that fine and penalty power that CFPB has, you are not going to see lenders really going there. It's like if you've been doing this for a while, you might remember that waiving a 3-day rescission period initially on a refinance people did it all the time. And then the lawsuit started. And you will not see a lender under any circumstances practically waiving a 3-day rescission period on a refinance. I think it's going to be like that.
Yeah, and I've heard a lender talking about it, that a financial hardship is not if you lose your job, not if you even lose a spouse, which I would think that would be.
I think they put it in there for like if your loan is going to foreclosure and you're going to lose the house.
Or maybe loss of limbs or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
really.
It's not clearly defined, but that's a couple of the examples I've heard. It's really dire circumstances that can't be mitigated.
So if someone's saying that you can waive those days, so everyone needs to know that that's built into the transaction too. So maybe, once this gets, I don't think it's the end of the world. It's doom and gloom. I really don't. But I think we all need to remember that this is the biggest change that we've had in our profession really since 1974 when RESPA came into effect. And I think it's going to take a few minutes for our lender friends to get comfortable, to understand how their regulator is going to deal with them. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been very generous.
Oh, I thought you were going somewhere else.
They're generous and aggressive with their fines. I mean, lenders have had $27 million fines, $20 million. I mean, there was just one last week, and I can't remember, but it was a huge fine.
Well, there was a company just Friday or Thursday, I think, that got really large fines for kickbacks.
Yeah, kickback. So I think we need to remember, and the point of this particular conversation, which, escrow people can talk and talk and talk and talk, is about that we want to let realtors know that they need to be informed. They need to talk to their settlement agent, their escrow person, and to say, do you know about this? If your escrow person doesn't know about this, I've said it in front of groups, you need to get somebody else because we need to be ready.
And we've been talking about it a long time.
And we have been. So you need to be ready. The realtors need to they need to make sure their clients know what the expectations should be.
And they need to be realistic. So, sometimes that's harder for salespeople because you want to be people pleasers. And as escrow people, we want to please everybody and make it happen too. But these are things that are just not negotiable. So we might as well deal with it, create the right expectations with the consuming public, and everybody's lives will be a lot easier. I see Tracy.
Just one word, communication again. I don't think you can stress it enough, and be nice to each other. Everybody has the same goal. Everybody has the same agenda. We all want to close the deal.
Yeah. And to that end, I think you're going to see a lot of use of calendars. And you might want to ask your escrow officer about, can we create a calendar that we share? Let's work together on penciling out this timeline. I think you're going to be seeing escrow officers starting to ask you again for sort of, information sheets that will help us know what's going on and where your clients are going to be and how many of them there are, and is there a possibility for other people to be involved in the transaction.
I think that agents need to go to CAR, California Association of Realtors. What kind of education can they get? If they have at their local boards where people are talking about TRID, which by the way is again dirt spelled backwards, and now you can see why it is, that they get that education. They maybe even escrow. I mean, even escrow associations are giving
associations that are giving them, and classes. Escrow Institute has a presentation tailored for escrow for real estate agents, and anyone in this room is probably
the broker should be educating their agents too, and they should be having conversations like, do the termite report when you take the listing, so before you even sell the house, if you're going to do it, who's going to pay for it? All those things are going to save a minute. Check out how much you want to pay for a home warranty policy and what kind of coverage you have. Do the simple things up front. Credits are huge. I cannot stress that enough.
You can't just say, instead of doing a repair, you might credit the buyer $2,000 because you have lender credits, maybe you have other credits. A transaction coordinator that I talk to a lot thinks that maybe a lot of repairs will actually be done before it closes, which may build in time too.
Yes.
And my sense is that in reading everything connected with this is that while the CFPB is saying small credits to the buyer between the buyer and seller for repairs at just prior to closing are not going to be a delay, that isn't necessarily true of credits from others.
Correct.
Credits from the lender are no. Lender's fees cannot change from the day that first loan estimate is issued until the day it closes, unless there's a change circumstance.
And remember that each lender, and the challenge with this rule is that each lender is going to have their perspective. As each of us sitting at this table, we have our little take on the thing. So.
Anyway. So the other thing you might begin to see, and this is something I personally have done for over 20 years, is a single line escrow fee. And you might start to see companies going that direction because that's really what we're hearing from lenders that they want to see. They want to see an all-in figure. And that will make their lives easier, which will make our lives easier and everyone else's lives easier. So, and we may not be the only ones. I think the title industry is
They're looking in that direction as well.
But they have state regulators to keep happy. So, Linda, you can speak to that.
We have just filed a bundled rate, single line. The only thing we don't add to that is a loan tie-in fee, which I think most of us charge. It's not fair to bundle that if you've got a cash transaction, obviously. So we have just done that. We have simplified our fee schedule completely.
And notary fees are not included because those are not part of your escrow fee, despite what the lender and the CFPB think.
Right. No, we do not include the notary fees in that, but everything else is included.
And we need to pay attention, and know that, our expenses are going up. I mean, all across the board for us to implement the new software, for us to do training for people. And unfortunately, I don't know the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau really thought about what's going to happen to the consumers because we can't keep absorbing, our profession can't absorb these fees. So
Lenders and title and escrow, we've absorbed an enormous amount of additional costs because of regulation in the last 10 years. And we all know what the last 10 years economy has been like. So unfortunately, that is going to have to be passed along to consumers this time. We didn't do it in 2010, but it's unavoidable this time. So please understand, be gentle with us and understand that that's the reason that we're doing it. I think we're almost the end of this session. Yeah. So I want to say that, I love sitting down with my escrow peeps all the time talking because there's so many things that we can learn from Carmen and Tracy and Linda and PJ. And I'm really honored to be able to sit at this table and have this conversation. And I hope that in the future, what we'll do is we'll take one section and just make ourselves talk about that one thing. Oh, that's so hard for us.
We don't always agree, by the way.
No. But do we? I think we might have time since we have Linda here with us, and she is the seller financing queen of the world. We would like to have her talk just a minute about due on sale clauses versus acceleration clauses.
And maybe what we can say is how this came up the other day. So I was in my office, and my office is in San Diego, and Linda's office is in Oxnard, right, which is kind of miles and miles and miles away. And because I have this group of peeps, that I can call. I had a question in my office, and if you scroll down, Linda's looking at my laptop. One of my girls had this acceleration. They call it a due on sale clause. And they were not the same on the note. And just remember, and Linda will explain what those are. So I sent out an email to my escrow friendsters, as we call ourselves, and asked the question. And Linda is quite an expert on this because she teaches lots of classes about seller carryback. So hit it, Linda.
Thank you, Gina. So before I go into this, I think it's important to note that along with all of this other Dodd-Frank regs and new rules that we're watching and learning about, in July of last year, Dodd-Frank did issue a regulation that put private financing into sort of the same boat as all loans. They made them loan originators, just like an institutional lender. So we're not going to go into all those particulars. I just warn everybody out there to pay attention to your seller financing transactions because they are now regulated and they do require disclosures under certain circumstances if your seller is not exempt. So be careful about that. Part of all of this is.
And what is the deal? It's like if the seller
does two or more
within a year,
within
12 calendar months.
Yes.
And let me tell you that my intent here was to tease our next program. So you can hear more from Linda on seller financing on our next program. Because there is more seller financing coming around, and the rules are much, much stricter now, as Linda alluded to. So when you're structuring a transaction with seller financing, you need to be aware of that.
And to be aware that using the correct terms is so important. We do sort of banter about acceleration clauses and due on sale clauses, and we tend to use them interchangeably, and they're not. We forget sometimes the terminology we use just because somebody doesn't understand it.
So let's go back. Let's talk about the due on sale clause, because our question.
We're teasing it for the next time. We're going to make them tune in next time for that information. So with that, because we are out of time, I want to thank our guests today, and I would like to let each of them sign off and say who they are and tell you how to contact them, starting with Carmen.
This is Carmen Martinez with Cardinal Pacific Escrow, and please feel free to contact me. You may reach me at carmen@cardinalpacific.com.
Tracy White, International City Escrow, and you can reach me at Tracy, Tracy, at icescrow.com.
And I'm Linda Hamilton with Chicago Title. You can reach me at linda.hamilton@ctt, that's cattomtom.com.
This is Gina. Okay, I love that CTT. This is Gina Engelstad from Elite Escrow Services, and my phone number, I'd love you to call me, is 858-560-4781 or Gina, Genia, at EliteEscrowServices.com.
And this has been PJ Garcia, Beach Pacific Escrow, pj@escrow.net. And you can call me at 714-842-4594. And thank you for listening.